I didn't take the job for excitement or adventure. Being a janitor in an old school was as uneventful as it sounded. A steady paycheck, quiet evenings, and the kind of solitude I'd come to appreciate. I've been working there for 6 months, and by then, I knew every inch of the building, or so I thought. Built sometime in the early 1900s, the school was a sprawling Gothic structure, all dark bricks and narrow hallways. The ceilings were high, the windows tall and arched, but the years hadn't been kind to it. The floors creaked with every step, the lights flickered unpredictably, and the air always carried a faint chill, as though the building itself was holding on to memories it didn't want to share. Most of the time, I worked alone after the students and staff had left for the day. Alone, except for the whispers about the basement. It started with a comment from one of the history teachers, Mr. Grayson, who caught me heading downstairs for cleaning supplies late one evening. "Don't stay down there too long," he said with a forced laugh. "Why's that?" I asked. "Just weird vibes, you know. The old place has its quirks." I thought he was joking, but I noticed the tension in his expression. He glanced toward the staircase, as if expecting something to appear. Then there was Mrs. Cooper, the head administrator, who made her feelings about the basement perfectly clear. One afternoon, I casually mentioned that the air seemed colder down there, half joking that the heating didn't reach it. She stiffened. "Just stay out of there," she said curtly. "Nothing you need to see." I laughed awkwardly, thinking she was kidding, but her expression didn't change. "Seriously, don't go near it." Her warning stuck with me, not because I was superstitious, but because it was so out of character. She wasn't the kind of woman to joke around, but there was an edge of something in her voice I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. The basement was a strange place. Most of it was typical: a boiler room, a storage area for cleaning supplies, and a few forgotten classrooms that had been repurposed for junk. But there was one door at the far end of the main hallway, and that door was different. It was heavy, industrial, and out of place in a school. Where all the other doors were wooden, this one was reinforced steel with a small, grated window at eye level. It was painted a dull gray, but the paint had started to peel, revealing rusted metal underneath. And unlike the other doors, this one had no nameplate or sign to indicate what was inside. I first noticed it when I started the job, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until I overheard snippets of conversations that my curiosity began to grow. Should have sealed it off years ago. Bad energy down there? Wasn't always a school, you know. One evening, as I was finishing mopping the science wing, I heard something strange, a faint, rhythmic sound. Top, top, top. I froze, listening. The sound was coming from the floor beneath me. The basement. I told myself it was probably the old pipes or the boiler acting up again. The building was ancient, after all, but the sound was too deliberate, too measured to be mechanical. It sounded like knocking. I ignored it at first, focusing on finishing my shift. But as the evening stretched on, the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder. By the time I headed down to the basement to put away my supplies, I was on edge. The basement was as cold and unwelcoming as always. My footsteps echoed as I descended the creaky stairs, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The knocking grew louder. It was coming from the forbidden door. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I told myself to turn around and go back upstairs, but my feet refused to move. Step by step, I approached the door. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to become. The beam of my flashlight wavered, barely cutting through the gloom. When I reached the door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were scratches around the edges of the frame, deep grooves that looked like claw marks. My stomach churned, and I took a step back. The scratches weren't random. They formed a pattern, almost like symbols. That's when the knocking started again, louder and more insistent. I pressed my ear to the door, my breath fogging the cold metal. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone in there?" No answer, but I swore I heard breathing, shallow, raspy, and close. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I grabbed the handle and twisted it. Locked. Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but then I noticed something. The scratches around the door frame weren't on the outside. They were on the inside. I stumbled back from the door, my pulse racing. The idea that the scratches were inside, that something had been trying to get out, was enough to make my skin crawl. The breathing stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it felt alive. I backed away, my flashlight beam fixed on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. Then I heard it, a voice. It was faint, muffled by the steel, but unmistakably human. A man's voice, low and trembling, whispering something I couldn't make out. I stepped closer, my fear momentarily overridden by curiosity. What? What are you saying? I called, my voice shaky. The whispering stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, and then the voice spoke again. This time it was louder, more distinct. It was pleading. Help, please let me out. My heart sank. Someone was in there. Someone alive. Hold on, I shouted. I'll get help. I turned and bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. My mind raced. How long had that person been trapped in there? Why hadn't anyone told me? Was this some kind of sick prank? When I reached the main floor, I grabbed my phone and dialed Mrs. Cooper. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy and irritated. It's late, she snapped. What's the emergency? There's someone in the basement, I blurted. Behind that door. They're trapped. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then she spoke, her tone colder than I'd ever heard it. You imagined it. No, I heard them. I insisted. They were whispering, begging for help. We need to call someone. You'll do no such thing, she interrupted. Go home, lock up, and forget about it. That's an order. Her response stunned me into silence. When I finally found my voice, I tried again. You don't understand. Someone's. Good night, she said firmly, and hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Why didn't she care? I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That there were scratches on the inside of a locked door and a voice begging for help? They'd think I was crazy. I didn't go home. Instead, I grabbed a crowbar from the maintenance closet and headed back to the basement. If Mrs. Cooper wasn't going to do anything, I would. The air was colder than before, biting in my skin even through my jacket. The door loomed in the flashlight's beam, the scratches seeming deeper, more menacing. The voice was silent now, but I could feel something beyond the door. Something watching me. I wedged the crowbar into the edge of the frame and heaved. The metal groaned in protest, but it didn't budge. I tried again, putting all my weight into it. And then the knocking started again. It was furious this time, desperate. It felt like whatever was inside could sense what I was doing and was fighting to be free. Hold on, I shouted. I'm trying. The crowbar slipped, and I stumbled backward, landing hard on the cold floor. My flashlight rolled away, its beam spinning wildly across the walls. That's when I saw them. Shadows. They weren't cast by the light. These shadows moved on their own, darting across the walls and ceiling like living things. They flickered and stretched, their shapes shifting into forms I couldn't quite make out. And they were closing in on me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but the shadows didn't retreat. They swirled and danced, their movements erratic and hungry. The voice came again, louder this time, and filled with terror. Don't open it. I froze. What? I whispered. Don't open the door, the voice repeated. It was no longer pleading. It was warning me. The shadows surged forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and I felt an overwhelming pressure, like the air itself was trying to crush me. The crowbar slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, but I didn't stop until I was back in the main hallway, the basement door slamming shut behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. Something was wrong with that room. I didn't know what, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back down there. Or so I thought. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows twisting and writhing, heard the frantic knocking and the voice warning me to stop. By morning, I was exhausted, but one thing was clear. I needed answers. When I got to work, I went straight to Mrs. Cooper's office. She looked up from her desk, her usual stern expression firmly in place. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "What's behind that door?" I demanded. She frowned, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "We've already discussed this. You're not to concern yourself with it." I heard someone. I insisted. A man's voice. He said, "You imagined it," she interrupted. "This isn't up for discussion." I slammed my hand on the desk, startling her. "You're hiding something. I don't care what you say. There's something wrong with that room." For a moment, I thought she might call security. Instead, her expression softened, and she sighed heavily. "You should have left it alone," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But now," she shook her head, "you wouldn't understand. Try me." She hesitated, then stood and closed the office door. When she turned back to me, her face was pale. "Do you know what this building used to be?" she asked. "A school?" "Before that." I shook my head. She crossed her arms, her eyes distant. "This place was a sanatorium back in the 1930s. They called it the Turner Institute for the Mentally Afflicted. It was supposed to be a place for healing, but she trailed off." "But what?" She looked me in the eye, her expression grim. "People started disappearing. Patients, staff, sometimes entire families. Officially, the institute closed due to funding issues, but there were rumors, terrible rumors about experiments, about people being locked away in places where they couldn't be found." The room spun as I processed what she was saying. "And the door?" I asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's one of the original rooms, the ones they used for containment. After the institute shut down, the building sat empty for decades. When they converted it into a school, they boarded up that section of the basement. But some things can't be sealed away." Her words chilled me to the bone, but I wasn't done. "There's something alive down there," I said. "I saw." She held up a hand. "You didn't see it. Whatever's down there isn't alive. Not in the way you understand." I opened my mouth to argue, but she cut me off. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "The room feeds on attention. The more you think about it, the stronger it becomes. That's why we tell people to leave it alone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded insane, but deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. "What happens now?" I asked. She looked at me sadly. "Now, you do your best to forget. Stay away from the basement. Focus on your work, and whatever you do, don't go near that door again." I left her office feeling more confused and terrified than ever. Forgetting wasn't an option, not after what I'd seen. For the next few days, I tried to avoid the basement, but it wasn't easy. Cleaning supplies were stored down there, and every trip felt like walking into a trap. The door seemed to watch me, the air around it heavy with unspoken threats. And then the dream started. Every night, I found myself back in the basement, standing in front of the door. In the dreams, it was always open, the darkness beyond yawning like a mouth ready to devour me. Whispers filled the air, growing louder until they became screams. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The line between dreams and reality blurred, and I began to dread sleep almost as much as the basement itself. One night, I woke to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but it didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere inside my apartment. I got up, my heart pounding, and followed the sound to the front door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. But as I stood there, I felt a cold draft, and a faint voice whispered in my ear, "Come back." I slammed the door and locked it, my hand shaking. It was the door. Somehow, it was reaching out to me. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, real answers. Mrs. Cooper had told me just enough to scare me, but not enough to explain what was happening. I decided to dig into the building's history myself. At the town library, I found an old file on the Turner Institute. Most of it was mundane, photos of the building, patient records, a few newspaper clippings. But buried in the back was an article from 1937 with a headline that sent a shiver down my spine. "Dozens missing at Turner Institute. Foul play suspected." The article described a series of disappearances over several months. Patients and staff had vanished without a trace, and the police investigation had turned up nothing. Witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the lower levels. Knocking, screaming, and voices that didn't belong to anyone. I kept reading, my dread growing with every paragraph. One witness claimed to have seen a man dragged into one of the rooms by something. He was screaming, the witness said, but there was no one there, just shadows. The last line of the article hit me like a punch to the gut. The room where the incident occurred has since been sealed. Authorities have declined to comment. It was the door. I left the library with the file clutched tightly in my hands, my mind racing. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to drop this, to walk away and pretend I'd never seen that door or read about the horrors that had unfolded here decades ago. But it was too late. By the time I returned to the school that evening, something had changed. The building felt different, colder, darker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were aware of me, watching, waiting. The basement was supposed to be off limits for me now. Mrs. Cooper had made that perfectly clear, but the knocking had returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Each time it echoed through the floor, it felt like the sound was burrowing into my skull, drawing me back to that cursed door. I tried to focus on my work, mopping the hallways and wiping down desks, but the sound wouldn't stop. It seemed to follow me, no matter where I went. By the time I reached the science wing, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw down my mop, grabbed the flashlight from my cart, and made my way to the basement. The air grew colder with every step I took, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering erratically. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, the only light came from my flashlight. The door loomed ahead, more menacing than ever. The scratches on the frame seemed deeper now, as if something had been clawing at it relentlessly. And the knocking had grown frantic, desperate. But this time there was something else, a voice. It wasn't the same voice I'd heard before. This one was deeper, rougher, and filled with a kind of venom that made my skin crawl. "Come closer," it hissed. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hands. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. "Closer," the voice repeated, stretching the word out like a taunt. The shadows began to shift. They slithered along the walls, taking on shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Limbs bent at impossible angles, heads turned too far, mouths opened too wide. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, they moved closer to the door, gathering around it like moths to a flame. "Let me out," the original voice pleaded, barely audible now. I took a step back, my flashlight beam darting around the room. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic blood. Then the door began to move. It started with a low groan, the hinges straining as if under immense pressure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to open. "No," I whispered, my heart pounding. "No, no." The voice behind the door screamed, a guttural, inhuman sound that reverberated through the room. The shadows surged forward, pouring through the crack like black smoke, their forms twisting and writhing. And then I saw it. Eyes. Burning red eyes, staring out from the darkness beyond the door. They locked onto me, and I felt a cold, crushing weight settle over my chest. "Too late," the rough voice growled. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, the force of it knocking me off my feet. My flashlight skittered across the floor, plunging me into darkness. The warning. When I came to, I was lying at the foot of the stairs. My head throbbed, and my hands were trembling as I scrambled to my feet. The basement was silent now, the door standing as it had before, closed, with no sign of the chaos I'd just witnessed. I stumbled upstairs, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I didn't even realize I was heading for Mrs. Cooper's office until I was standing outside her door. She looked up as I entered, her face pale. "You went back," she said flatly. "You knew." I spat. "You knew what was down there, and you didn't warn me." "I did warn you," she said quietly. "You didn't listen." "What the hell is that thing?" I demanded. "What's behind that door?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not a thing. It's the remnants of what they did here. The pain, the fear, the violence, it left a mark. That room is a scar, and the scar never healed." I shook my head, trying to process her words. That doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. It's not supposed to, she said. The door isn't just a door. It's a gateway. To what, I don't know. But whatever's on the other side has been trying to get through for decades. Her words chilled me to the core. Why not destroy it? I asked. We tried, she said. Years ago, when we first opened the school. We sealed it, boarded it up, tried to forget about it. But you can't destroy something like that. It's alive. And now that you've opened it. I didn't open it. I interrupted. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Didn't you? I don't remember running. I don't remember driving home or collapsing into bed. All I remember is the cold, the weight of the shadows, and the voice that wouldn't stop echoing in my mind. You belong to us. I stayed home the next day, calling in sick. My head throbbed, and my thoughts were a scrambled mess. But no amount of aspirin could dull the memories flooding back. The sanatorium, the patients, the experiments. My reflection in the lab coat, my hands tying restraints, my voice telling them it was all for their own good. I couldn't reconcile it with the life I knew. I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't even old enough to have worked in the Turner Institute. And yet, I remembered it as clearly as I remembered my own name. The dreams that night were worse. I was back in the basement, standing in front of the door. It was wide open this time, a swirling void of shadows and red light spilling out. Figures emerged from the darkness. Patients-eyed led into the room, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes accusing. You did this to us, they said, their voices a haunting chorus. I woke with a scream, drenched in sweat. My apartment felt smaller, suffocating. I needed to get out to clear my head. Instead, I found myself driving to the school. The building was empty, the halls dark and silent. I made my way to the basement, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door was waiting for me. The scratches around the frame were deeper now, the symbols almost glowing in the dim light of my flashlight. In the air, it was alive, humming with an energy that made my skin crawl. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. But something inside me knew I couldn't leave without confronting the truth. This time, the door wasn't locked. I turned the handle, and it swung open with a low groan. The room beyond was impossibly large, far bigger than the dimensions of the basement should have allowed. The walls were lined with old equipment, rusted gurneys, shattered monitors, and shelves stacked with dusty files. But the center of the room was empty, except for a single chair bolted to the floor. The chair. I recognized it immediately. It was the same one I'd seen in my dreams. The same one from the memories that weren't mine. The leather straps hung loosely from its arms, stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. I stepped closer, the air growing colder with every step. As I approached, I noticed something carved into the back of the chair, symbols like the ones on the door, but more intricate, more deliberate. And then I saw the figure. It was sitting in the chair, slumped forward as if asleep. Its body was thin, skeletal, wrapped in tattered fabric that might have once been a hospital gown. Its hands rested on the armrests, the fingers unnaturally long and claw-like. As I drew closer, its head snapped up, the eyes were burning red, and its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide for its face. "You came back," it said, its voice a guttural rasp. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Well, what are you?" It stood slowly, unfolding itself like a puppet on invisible strings. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, but it radiated a presence that filled the room. "I am the result," it said, "the culmination of their work. And yours." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not. I didn't." "You did," it said, stepping closer. Its voice was calm, almost gentle, but its eyes burned with hatred. "You opened the door. You fed the room. And now, you will complete what you started." The shadows in the room began to move, swirling around me like a living storm. The chair stood empty now, waiting. "No," I said again, backing toward the door. "I didn't mean to." The figure laughed, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the walls. "Meaning doesn't matter," it said. "Intent doesn't matter. You crossed the threshold. You're part of this now." The shadows surged forward, and I felt their cold tendrils wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me toward the chair. I fought against them, but they were too strong. As I was forced into the chair, the figure leaned down, its face inches from mine. "You will become what you feared," it said. "You will take my place, and the room will continue." The straps tightened around my wrists and ankles, and I felt the symbols carved into the chair burning into my skin. The figure stepped back, its grin widening, and then everything went dark. They found me the next morning, lying in the basement, the door wide open behind me. The chair was gone. I was taken to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain the strange symbols burned into my wrists or the cold, glassy look in my eyes. I don't remember much of what happened after that night, but I know one thing for sure. The room is still there, and it's waiting for its next victim. Every night, I hear the knocking. Every night, it calls for me to return. And someday I know I will. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.